Hello, Brian Miller-Hicks here. We're talking about mass movement, slope failures, landslides, sometimes called mass wasting. This is the phenomenon, which can be quite hazardous to us, of moving soil, moving rock, moving down a slope, steep, shallow, under many types and ranges of conditions. Hopefully this is nobody's house that we know. This is in Southern California, and Southern California has its share of mass movement and slope failure. If your building site is not properly prepared, if the engineers and geologists have failed to consider that there may be an old slide underneath your house that hasn't been repaired, and if you cut into it or change the shape of the hillside, it may trigger that slide and cause it to move again. As a professional, I've actually worked on many landslides, many slope failures, have been involved with mapping them, identifying them, mapping them, testing the soil and rock, figuring out their configuration, the depth of the sliding mass, the size of the mass, and have consulted with engineers on how to repair these slides if they are a threat or a hazard to construction or to health and life in certain situations. So there are certain factors which affect the likelihood of a failing slope. Forces that make the soil and rock masses move down slope are called driving forces. The forces that tend to keep a slope stable, keep it from failing, are called resisting forces. If the driving forces are greater than the resisting forces, then material moves under the influence, of course, of gravity. Slope steepness is another factor. A very steep slope can have rapid, disastrous debris flow type failures, but slope steepness is not necessarily a limiting factor when it comes to slope failures. Many slopes fail even if they're gently inclined, if the material composing the slope is very weak or sheared or wet and has certain conditions of geologic structure which promote it sliding or failing. Moisture or water, of course, is a driving force. The more wet a material is, the weaker it can become and the more easily mobilized. So weak, fractured, or sheared material, wet material, is prone to moving down slope. If you have a well-defined failure surface, that can be a big factor. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say we have sandstone beds on a hill that are dipping down towards or parallel to or near parallel to the descending slope. If you have below those sandstone layers a claystone, which can become wet and then become weak and slippery, the sandstone up above it, even if the sandstone is pretty strong, can slide and slip over that weak clay layer down below. So that's what I mean by a well-defined failure surface. If you overload a slope, if you put a load of construction material or fill at the top of a weak slope, it can fail. Earthquakes, of course, have caused and will cause in the future many, many slope failures by tectonic stresses, seismic waves, shaking apart material, mobilizing it, and letting it move down slope. Secondary factor is fire and deforestation. Trees and vegetation tend to anchor the top few feet of soil. If you remove trees, say you cut down a forest, that can expose the hillside to more rain, to more moisture. The trees that were taking up moisture and water through their root systems are not there anymore. Therefore, you're setting up conditions for slope failure. Fire, of course, can destroy a forest and do pretty much the same thing, can lead to non-support or non-binding of the superficial soil layers and make it more prone to failure. Resisting forces include friction. Friction is a natural resistance of a material to movement or sliding. The material strength, the stronger the material, the more cohesive it is, the more solid it is, the less likely it is to actually break apart and move down slope. And as I've already mentioned, trees and vegetation can help contribute to resisting forces. So, simple diagram or graphic that shows the role of water in weakening a slope. On the left side, you have a stable slope, let's say it's composed of loose sand. When it's dry, the sand grains contact each other, so you have grain-to-grain contact, and the grains kind of lock up with each other and tend to not move. If you add a lot of water through rainfall, you tend to float the grains apart. The grains are no longer contacting each other. They don't support each other. There's no longer a network of supporting forces. The grains separate, volume increases, the soil becomes weaker and can mobilize and flow downhill. Just a photo of a forest or a brush fire where you see the effects of a fire in progress, removing vegetation and weakening superficial soils. The after effect of heavy deforestation in the country of Costa Rica, and you can see these slopes have been stripped bare, denuded of vegetation, of trees. These light patches here are actually scars where you've had small slope failures, soil sliding down slope because you've removed the support from vegetation and trees. What kind of mass movement are there? There are different types. And in this presentation, I'm going to go from the slowest to the fastest. So we have mass movement classification based on the rate or velocity of the moving material. We have the type of material, whether it's strong or weak. We have the moisture content, whether it's dry or wet. And we have different modes of movement. We have flows, we have sliding, we have falls, as in rockfall. So there's different types, different factors. Let's explore all that. This is the slowest type of mass movement or slope failure. It's called creep. Creep happens in the superficial soils, only a couple feet from ground surface, and it's caused by two primary processes. You have a freeze-thaw cycle, where water in the soil causes when it's freezing, or when you have a freezing weather, the water can freeze, of course, turn to ice, and lift up grains of soil, clay, sand, silt, what have you. So they move up, as you see along these blue arrows, and then when you have a thaw, these grains drop, and the net effect is of grains moving down slope. So up and then down, up and down, gradually moving the soil down the slope. You have the same type of effect by expansion and contraction, primarily in clay-rich soils. certain clays, when you add water, will expand, and you'll get the same kind of phenomenon, only with clay expansion rather than freezing. Creep moves at the rate of millimeters per day, centimeters per month, inches per year. It's not fast, but it happens on every slope that you see, pretty much. If you have a slope with soil on it, the soil is going to be pulled down by the effects of gravity. What can creep do? Can it hurt us? Not likely in terms of injury or death, but it can cause damage to structures and trees. So you have here a clearly marked zone of creep. The soil and rock fragments in this zone are creeping down slope at a slow rate. As it does so, it can cause trees growing in the soil to actually bend. Trees want to grow straight, so they'll initially grow straight, but if the soil is moving under them, as this lower part of the trunk is bent forward, the tree still tries to grow up straight, so in effect you get a curved trunk growth. Creep can knock over old tombstones, it can tilt fences, it can break retaining walls, it can damage roadways. What this shows here is steeply inclined sedimentary rock, and you see the upper ends of the layers of these sedimentary rock, are bending forward along with the creeping soil. So you have some damage on the roadway here. What would you, if you were an engineer or a geologist advising engineers, what would you do about this? How would you fix this? Yeah, you could patch the asphalt surface, but it would still creep, and then you'd have to come back a year or two later and do the same thing. So what do? You take out the road surface, you excavate below the creep zone, and you build this removed soil back up with good compacted engineered soil. You'll also repair this retaining wall, put some drains behind it so that you don't get water pressure building up behind a wall. Water pressure or hydrostatic pressure building up behind structures or against structures is one of the primary reasons why structures fail. Now this doesn't happen much in Southern California where I'm at, but it can happen in Arctic or subarctic regions. This is a phenomenon that we call solifluction. Solifluction occurs when you have freezing surface soil, which then through the Arctic summer starts to melt. The ice in the surface soil starts to melt and mobilize the upper layers of soil so that it flows in this fashion, sort of discrete lobes, as you see here. This type of slope failure is called a slump. You see this block or several blocks kind of dropping down because of some unstable condition, leaving typically a cliff or a vertical face near the top. This is called a scarp, and these are called slump blocks. So the whole thing is just like drooping or slumping downwards under the influence of gravity, weak material, and the fact that over here we have water, I believe this is the ocean, actually undercutting this material, removing support, and making everything shift downwards. This is a variant of a slump. You have slumping and vertical faces, scarps up here, taking out this road, and you have a surface of rupture. This is what, in a material that's pretty homogeneous, let's say it's a deep clay-rich soil, you'll often get a curving surface of breakage, and there's actually sometimes a rotational component where it slumps downward and then comes up a little bit, pushing up this mass above the pre-existing surface. And this lower mass of material that's failed from up above typically is wet and poorly drained because of concentration of water coming into these cracks, into the scarp, into the disrupted landscape, and just saturating the lower parts of the slump so that it becomes what we call an earth flow. Now these slump earth flows can be, under certain conditions, very, very hazardous, dangerous. In 2014, up in Washington State, this slump earth flow occurred. So slumping up here, very wet, saturated conditions down here, which are actually not helped by the fact that a river runs through this area right here. So the reason this slope failed in the first place is because this whole hillside, mountainside, is made of stratified, very young, poorly consolidated glacial deposits, sand and silt. So to begin with, they're not very strong materials. Secondarily, as you probably know, Washington State gets a lot of rain, and the fact that this river flows through here was undercutting this part of the slope. So on March 22nd of that year, this slumped down, collapsed, this whole mass of material disintegrated and flowed downwards, actually burying a small subdivision, and a number of people died as their homes were buried. It's a pretty disastrous, sad event. Here in Southern California, we have sometimes hazardous conditions as well. This type of mass movement or slope failure is pretty rapid. Remember, we've been going from slow to more and more rapid. It's called a debris flow. What you need for this type of event to occur is a steep, debris-filled canyon, like you see here. This canyon is pretty steep, 30, 40 degrees maybe. It's been filled with soil being eroded from the hillsides and filling up the head of this canyon. Excuse me. This material, pardon me, becomes saturated, mobilized, and very rapidly moves down slope, taking everything with it, whether it's rocks, trees, cars, homes. It can move pretty fast, 20 miles an hour perhaps, and without warning can engulf homes. Even though many people think of Southern California as a dry place, we do periodically get quite wet winters with a series of strong, intense rainstorms, which can set up conditions for these to occur. In the town of La Conchita along the coast near Santa Barbara area, January 2005, this slope made of sheared, faulted, and weak material failed in a debris mud flow. Came down in 2005, engulfing a few homes, killing, I think, 4 or 5 people, and overtopping this wall, as you see here. This wall was built in response to a landslide slope failure in 1995, 10 years previous to this one. This was thought to be one of the measures that might stop future problems. Well, as you can see, it didn't work very well. This is a view looking from the hilltop downhill. You can see this mass of failed material. You can see water running down the canyon. It's very wet still. And you can see the lobe, or the mass of material deposited on the flat below, engulfing a few houses. And here's the coastline out here. This is another type of slope failure called a block glide. This has to do with geologic structure. Conditions that set up the slope failure have to do with the structure of geology, the stratigraphy, the layering of the rock. So we have somewhat tilted or inclined sandstone dipping down this way to the left. Everything's sitting on top of a clay bed. A dam was built, and no, I'm sorry, let me back up. This set up conditions where the clay bed became saturated and the sandstone slipped on top of the clay bed, building up a lake in 1925. 2 years later, in 1927, this lake busted through this landslide dam, flooded downstream areas, and killed at least 6 people. Here's a photo of the scar. Earthquakes can, as I said, cause slope failures. This is, I believe, in 1958 in Alaska. A huge earthquake shook loose all this debris of rock. This is a glacial valley, a main glacier through here and side glaciers up here. As you may learn, glaciers scrape away rock and soil, carry that material downslope. So there's a lot of loose material hanging up on these oversteepened mountain rock slopes, which failed during an earthquake, coalescing into a huge spreading avalanche, as you see here. Fortunately, nobody lives up here, but it's a classic case of an earthquake-generated avalanche. Even more rapid than an avalanche is a rockfall. On the highway going to Yosemite, this happened in 1997. This is very fractured granitic type rock. And as you can see, the rocks came tumbling down. This huge rock impacted this road. How would you fix this? How would you repair this? Basically, all you can do is dynamite this into smaller pieces and haul it away. This is an actual live photo of an active rockfall taken in August of 2006. Rocks falling right off these granitic cliff faces and raising a big dust cloud. Photo taken by Mr. Herb Dunn. Fortunately, he was not harmed, but he did manage to get some pretty spectacular photos. So that's the range of slope failures all the way from slow creep to rapid rockfall. And the conditions that set up slope failures include, of course, moisture, lack of support from vegetation, weak, shattered, sheared, faulted material, and gravity.